The training room smelled like dry erase markers and recycled air. 23 people occupied the chairs arranged in theater-style rows, most of them scrolling through phones while they waited. I stood near the projection screen, adjusting the connection between my laptop and the display. The quarterly process training was scheduled to begin in 6 minutes. My boss, Director Torres, entered through the side door. She moved with the kind of precision that people develop when they're constantly aware of being watched. Her heels clicked against the tile floor in rhythmic punctuation. She caught my eye and tilted her head toward the hallway. That small gesture that means follow me. I unplugged my laptop and walked out after her. The hallway outside the training room had windows overlooking the courtyard. Morning light came through at sharp angles, creating geometric shadows across the industrial carpet. Torres stopped near the water fountain, arms crossed. "Sally, I'm making a change to today's session." I waited. "You slow the room down." All those detailed explanations and step-by-step walkthroughs, people zone out. We need energy. Momentum. I'm having Donovan lead the training instead. Donovan. Marketing specialist. Charismatic. Great at presentations. Had been with next-gen technologies for 7 months. Understood, I said. Torres blinked. She'd positioned herself for an argument, body language ready to deflect objections. My immediate agreement seemed to throw off her rhythm. "I knew you'd be professional about this. It's not a reflection on your work. Just a different approach for a different audience." "Of course. You can sit in if you want. Observe. Might pick up some presentation tips." "I'll pass. I have documentation to update." She nodded, already turning back toward the training room. "Great. I'll let Donovan know he's up." I walked back to my office on the 4th floor. It was a corner space, earned through 9 years of steady competence rather than loud achievement. 2 windows, a door that actually closed, and enough room for the reference library I'd built, 3 shelves of compliance manuals, technical specifications, and process documentation that most people thought existed only in digital form. I pulled up the training materials I'd prepared. 47 slides covering the new compliance process for client onboarding. Each slide linked to supporting documentation. Each step mapped to regulatory requirements. Each checkpoint tied to quality metrics that would prevent the kind of errors that turned into lawsuits. The process was complicated because the regulations were complicated. Because the risks were real. Because getting it wrong meant 6-figure fines and clients who went to competitors. But Torres wanted energy and momentum. I opened a new document and started typing. Not updating documentation. Creating a different kind of record. Over the next 3 hours, I compiled every email I'd sent about the new compliance process. Every meeting note where I'd explained the requirements. Every technical specification I'd written. Every training outline I'd submitted. Timestamps, recipients, subject lines. The full paper trail of how this process was supposed to work. Then I saved the training materials I'd prepared onto a secure drive. The 47 slides with all their links and annotations and regulatory citations. Evidence of what should have been taught. My phone buzzed. A text from Owen in compliance. "Did you get pulled from training?" I called him. "What happened?" he asked. "Torres wants a different presentation style. Donovan's running it." Silence. Then, "Donovan doesn't know the process. He's charismatic." "Sally, this isn't a product demo. This is regulatory compliance. If people don't understand the checkpoints." "I know. So what are we doing?" I looked at the compliance manual on my shelf. All 600 pages of it, tabs marking the sections relevant to the new process. "We're documenting everything. I want you to keep track of every question that comes through after this training. Every mistake, every missed checkpoint, every time someone doesn't understand what they're supposed to do. Log it with timestamps and specifics." "You think it's going to fail?" "I think Donovan is going to teach what he understands, which is approximately 15% of what needs to be taught. And I think the consequences of that gap are going to become obvious very quickly." Owen was quiet for a moment. "You're building a case." "I'm being thorough." That afternoon, I attended a different meeting. The quarterly review with our external auditor, a woman named Clarissa who'd been auditing financial services companies for 26 years. She had silver hair cut short and the kind of direct gaze that made people confess things they'd planned to hide. "Sally," she said as I sat down across from her in the small conference room. "I understand NextGen is implementing a new onboarding process." "That's correct. It addresses the regulatory changes that came through last quarter." "Who's handling the training?" "That's in progress now." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not leading it." Director Torres felt a different approach would be more engaging for staff. "I see." Clarissa made a note on her tablet. "And the documentation? The process manuals?" "Complete. I can send you the full packet." "Please do. I'll want to review it before our next audit cycle." She paused. "Sally, you and I have worked together for 6 years. I've never seen a compliance gap at NextGen that you didn't catch before it became a problem. This new process is complex. Make sure whoever is training people understands that complexity." I provided all the materials needed. Materials aren't the same as understanding. I sent her the documentation that evening. All 412 pages of it, including the regulatory background, process flowcharts, checkpoint definitions, and error handling protocols. The complete picture of what the training should have covered. The training session ended at 3 p.m. I watched people file past my office on their way back to their desks. Some looked confused. A few were laughing at something, the kind of laughter that follows an entertaining presentation. Nobody looked like they'd just spent 3 hours absorbing critical regulatory information. At 4 p.m., my phone rang. "Torres. Great session today. Donovan really brought the energy. Got people excited about the new process. I'm glad it went well. Just wanted to thank you for being flexible about the change. Shows real team spirit." After she hung up, I opened my email. 3 messages from team members asking questions about the process. Basic questions. Things that should have been covered in minute 15 of the training. I answered each one thoroughly. Sent them links to the relevant sections of the documentation. Copied Owen on all of them for his records. By end of day, there were 8 more questions. The next morning, 12 questions waited in my inbox. The day after that, 19. People were trying to implement the new process and running into steps they didn't understand. Checkpoints they didn't know existed. Requirements nobody had mentioned. I answered every question. Documented every gap. Sent weekly summaries to Owen showing the pattern of confusion. On day 4 after the training, Torres came to my office. She didn't sit down. "Why does no one understand the process?" She wasn't quite shouting, but her voice had that sharp edge that precedes shouting. "I'm getting questions constantly. The implementation team is stuck. People are making errors. What's going on?" I looked up from my computer. "What specifically are people confused about?" "Everything. The checkpoints, the documentation requirements, the escalation procedures. Basic stuff that should have been covered in training." "Was it covered in training?" Donovan presented the materials. "Did he present the full training deck? All 47 slides with the regulatory background and step-by-step protocols?" Torres frowned. "He streamlined it. Hit the high points. We didn't need all that granular detail. The granular detail is the process. The high points are just conceptual overview. You need both." Well, people didn't get it. And now we have clients going through onboarding with staff who don't know what they're doing. I pulled up the folder where I'd been tracking questions. I've received 83 questions about the process since the training. All of them relate to material that was in the original training deck but not covered in Donovan's streamlined version. Then you need to do another training. Fix this. When would you like to schedule it? Now. This afternoon. Round up everyone who attended the first session and get them back in that training room. I'll need to check room availability and confirm people's schedules. Tomorrow morning might be more realistic. Fine. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. And Sally? Make it stick this time. She left. I sat there for a moment, looking at the space where she'd been standing. Make it stick. As if the problem was my teaching method rather than the decision to replace comprehensive training with an entertaining overview. I sent out the meeting invitations. All 23 original attendees plus Torres and Donovan. Subject line, Compliance Process Training, Complete Protocol Review. Attached the full 47-slide deck so people could preview if they wanted. Then I pulled up the documentation I'd been compiling. Emails, question logs, error reports. I organized it into a clean timeline showing exactly what had happened after the abbreviated training. Each mistake mapped to a specific topic that hadn't been covered. Each question linked to material that had been cut for time. That evening, I got a call from Owen. "Did you see the incident report?" "Which one?" "Client onboarding. Someone missed 3 of the compliance checkpoints. The client's account got flagged by the automated monitoring system. We had to freeze their access while we sorted it out." "How long were they frozen?" 6 hours. They're threatening to move to a competitor." "Who was the processor?" "Felicity. She's been here 4 years. Never made a mistake like this before." "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah. She said she didn't know those checkpoints existed. Said they weren't mentioned in the training." "They weren't. They were in slides 32 through 34. Donovan didn't present slides 30 through 41. "How do you know what he presented?" "I asked him. He was happy to tell me. Said he cut the technical weeds to focus on the big picture vision." Owen made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "Is Torres coming to your training tomorrow?" "She's invited. This should be interesting." The next morning, I arrived at the training room at 8:30. Set up my laptop, tested the projection system, arranged printed copies of the process manual on the side table. Not the full 600-page compliance manual, but the 80-page excerpt specific to the onboarding process. People started arriving at 8:50. Some looked annoyed at being pulled away from their work. Others looked relieved, like they'd been drowning and someone had finally thrown them a rope. Torres arrived at 9 sharp. She sat in the back row, tablet open, expression neutral. Donovan came in 2 minutes late, coffee cup in hand. He sat near the front, gave me an encouraging thumbs up like we were colleagues instead of like he'd replaced me 4 days ago. "Good morning," I said. "Thank you for making time for this session. I know you all attended a training on this process last week. This session will cover the complete protocol with all checkpoints and regulatory requirements." I started with the regulatory background. Why these requirements existed. What happened to companies that didn't follow them. Real examples, real fines, real consequences. Then I walked through the process. Every single step. Every checkpoint. Every piece of documentation required. Every escalation path. Every error scenario and how to handle it. I took questions after each section. People had a lot of questions. At slide 32, the checkpoints Felicity had missed, I paused. These 3 verification steps are mandatory before releasing an account for client access. Missing any of them triggers an automatic system hold and requires management override to resolve. The average resolution time is 4 to 6 hours, during which the client cannot access their account. Felicity raised her hand. "Is that what happened with the Morrison account yesterday?" "Yes. The account was flagged because these checkpoints weren't completed. That's exactly the kind of situation we're preventing by understanding this protocol." She nodded slowly, making notes. At 10:30, we took a 15-minute break. People stood up, stretched, formed clusters to talk. I heard fragments of conversation. "I didn't know about that step, that's why I kept getting errors, this makes so much more sense now." Torres approached me at the coffee station. "This is taking a long time. It's comprehensive training. The process is complex. People seem overwhelmed. They seem engaged. There's a difference. Overwhelmed means they're lost. Engaged means they're absorbing new information and asking questions to clarify." "How much longer?" "We're halfway through. Another 90 minutes. She pressed her lips together. Nodded. Went back to her seat. The second half covered quality metrics, audit requirements, and what to do when things went wrong. I showed them how to use the documentation. How to look up answers. How to escalate issues they couldn't resolve. At noon, I wrapped up. Final question, does everyone understand what they need to do to process a client onboarding according to the new compliance standards? 23 hands went up. Good. The complete process manual is available on the shared drive. I've also created a quick reference guide that fits on 2 pages. It lists every checkpoint in order with links to the detailed documentation. Use it. When you have questions, ask them. This process is too important to guess about. People filed out. Several stopped to thank me. Felicity lingered. I'm sorry about the Morrison account. I should have. You should have been taught the checkpoints in the initial training, I said. You did your best with incomplete information. That's not on you. After she left, Torres and Donovan remained. Torres stood, arms crossed. Donovan looked uncomfortable, his earlier confidence dimmed. That was very thorough, Torres said. Her tone made it unclear whether she meant it as a compliment. It was complete. That's different from thorough. People seemed to get more out of this session. People got information they needed to do their jobs correctly. That's what training is supposed to accomplish. Donovan cleared his throat. Look, I thought I hit the important parts last week. I didn't realize how much detail was necessary. It's a compliance process, I said. Detail isn't optional. It's the point. Torres's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted. I need to take this. We'll debrief later. She left quickly. Donovan followed. I was packing up my laptop when Owen appeared in the doorway. How'd it go? Better than last week. Torres looked unhappy. Torres looked like someone who just realized she created a problem that didn't need to exist. Owen leaned against the doorframe. Clarissa called me this morning. The auditor. She wanted to know about the training program for the new process. What did you tell her? I told her you'd provided comprehensive documentation and that staff training was ongoing. She asked if there had been any implementation issues. I said we'd had one incident that was resolved. That's accurate. She wants to see the training materials. Both sessions. And she wants to interview some of the staff about their understanding of the process. I looked at him. When? Next week. She's moving up the audit timeline. Said something about wanting to verify compliance controls during implementation phase rather than after. Which meant Clarissa had concerns. Auditors didn't move up timelines without reason. Do you need anything from me? Just keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Answer questions. Make sure people understand the process. He paused. She specifically asked if there had been any changes to who was responsible for training. I'm sure that will come up in her interviews. Over the next 3 days, the question volume dropped. Not to 0, but to a manageable level. People were following the process. The checkpoints were being completed. The error rate went down. Torres didn't call for that debrief she'd mentioned. Didn't email. Didn't drop by my office. On Monday, Clarissa arrived for her audit. She set up in the same small conference room we'd used before. She requested training materials, implementation records, and error logs. She interviewed 12 staff members randomly selected from those who'd attended both training sessions. That afternoon, she asked to meet with Torres. I wasn't invited, but Owen was. He texted me afterward, need to talk. Coffee? We met at the cafe across the street from the NextGen building. Owen looked tired. Clarissa is not happy, he said. About what specifically? About the gap between the 2 training sessions. She interviewed people who attended both. They told her the first training was entertaining but didn't cover the actual process. That they didn't understand what they were supposed to do until the second training. That's accurate. She asked Torres why there were 2 trainings. Torres said the first one was an overview and the second was deep dive technical detail. Clarissa asked who made the decision to separate them. Torres said it was a scheduling issue. That's inaccurate. Owen took a sip of his coffee. Clarissa then asked to see both sets of training materials. She compared them. She asked me why the first session omitted material that's required by regulation to be included in staff training. What did you say? I said I wasn't involved in planning the first session and couldn't speak to those decisions. She asked who could. I gave her your name. So she wants to talk to me. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. same conference room. I met with Clarissa at 9 a.m. She had both training decks printed out, annotated with highlighter and sticky notes. Sally, walk me through the planning for these trainings. I did. Explained the original comprehensive session I'd prepared. The morning Torres pulled me from it. The decision to have Donovan present instead. The questions that flooded in afterward. The incident with Felicity. The second training I'd conducted. Clarissa made notes. Asked questions. Reviewed the timeline I'd documented. Do you still have the original training deck you prepared for the first session? Yes. Is it materially different from what you presented in the second session? No. It's the same content. Same 47 slides. Same regulatory background. Same step-by-step protocols. So the second training wasn't a deep dive follow-up. It was the complete training that should have been delivered the first time. Yes. She set down her pen. Sally, I need to be frank with you. From a regulatory standpoint, NextGen had a 4-day period where staff were implementing a new compliance process without adequate training. That's a significant control gap. The fact that it was corrected doesn't erase that it existed. I understand. Director Torres' characterization of the two trainings as planned sequence, overview followed by deep dive, is inconsistent with what staff reported and what the materials show. I can't speak to Director Torres' characterization. I can only tell you what happened. Did you document your concerns about the first training before it happened? I didn't have concerns before it happened. I was planning to deliver comprehensive training. Director Torres made the decision to change instructors the morning of the session. There wasn't time to raise concerns. But you documented what happened afterward. I tracked questions and errors. That's standard practice for implementation monitoring. Clarissa smiled slightly. It's thorough practice. Not everyone does it. She gathered her papers. I'll need to include this in my audit report. There will be recommendations about training protocols and authorization procedures. The board will see it. I understand. One more question. If you could change one thing about how this was handled, what would it be? I thought about that. About the moment in the hallway when Torres had told me I slowed the room down. About the choice I'd made to step aside rather than fight. I would have insisted on reviewing whatever training materials Donovan planned to use before he delivered them. If I'd seen what was being cut, I could have flagged the regulatory gaps. Why didn't you? I wasn't asked to review them. I assumed Director Torres had ensured the content was complete. You assumed someone who isn't a compliance expert had verified compliance content. That was an error in judgment on my part. Clarissa nodded. Thank you for your candor. I'll have a draft report by end of week. 3 days later, Torres called me to her office. It was the corner office on the executive floor, twice the size of mine with a view of the downtown skyline. She sat behind a glass desk that always looked pristinely empty, like she did all her real work somewhere else. Sit, she said. I sat. I received Clarissa's preliminary audit findings. There's a section about the training program. About the gap in compliance coverage during the initial implementation period. I'm aware. She characterizes it as a control deficiency. Says it represents elevated risk during a critical process transition. That's accurate. Torres leaned forward. She also notes that the deficiency was corrected quickly and that subsequent error rates are within acceptable parameters. But the board is going to ask questions. About why it happened. About who's responsible. I waited. I need to understand your perspective. Why did the initial training fail to cover all the necessary material? It wasn't the training I prepared. Donovan streamlined it to focus on high-level concepts rather than detailed procedures. The compliance checkpoints were in the material that was cut. Did you review his materials beforehand? No. I wasn't asked to. Why not? I was removed from the training the morning it was scheduled. There wasn't an opportunity to coordinate with Donovan about content. Torres sat back. Her expression was difficult to read. Clarissa's report makes it sound like there was a breakdown in oversight. Like training was delivered without proper vetting. That would be an accurate characterization. But you could have prevented it. You could have reached out to Donovan. Offered to review his materials. Made sure he understood what needed to be covered. I looked at her steadily. Director Torres, you told me I slowed the room down. That people needed energy and momentum rather than detailed explanations. You specifically chose Donovan because his presentation style was different from mine. If I had then contacted him to change his presentation style to match mine, I would have been undermining your decision. So you just stepped aside. I documented the complete process and made myself available to answer questions. When it became clear there were gaps, I provided supplemental training. That's appropriate escalation. The audit report says there was a 4-day control gap. There was. That gap existed because comprehensive training wasn't delivered in the initial session. I corrected it as soon as Director Torres requested follow-up training. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside her window, I could see clouds moving across the skyline. The board is going to want accountability. They should have it. Whoever made the decision to deliver abbreviated training for a regulatory compliance process should account for that choice. Her jaw tightened. Are you saying this is my fault? I'm saying decisions have consequences. You decided to change trainers and presentation approach for a compliance training session. The result was incomplete training. That's causation, not fault. You could have fought harder. You could have insisted on delivering the training yourself. You could have escalated to me or to the board. I could have. But you're my direct supervisor. You made a decision about how a training should be conducted. I documented my concerns and remained available to provide support. When you asked me to deliver follow-up training, I did so immediately. That's appropriate professional conduct. Torres stood up. Paced to the window. The board meeting is Thursday. I need to present a response to the audit findings. What would you recommend? Acknowledge that the initial training was insufficient. Explain that supplemental training was provided promptly. Implement a protocol requiring compliance staff to review and approve all training materials for regulatory processes before delivery. Ensure anyone conducting compliance training has subject matter expertise verified by the compliance team. That's a lot of process. That's adequate control. Which is what the auditor is concerned about. Will you present with me? At the board meeting? I considered that. What would you want me to present? The corrective actions. The updated training protocol. Evidence that the process is under control now. I can do that. Thursday morning, I prepared materials for the board presentation. Not slides, they had Clarissa's written report. Instead, I brought metrics. Error rates before and after the complete training. Question volume over time. Implementation success rates. The numbers that proved the process was working now. The board met in a conference room that felt designed to intimidate. Mahogany table. Leather chairs. Portraits of past executives on the walls. 8 board members sat in arranged positions. Torres at one end. An empty chair beside her for me. The board chair, a man named Sterling who'd founded 3 companies before joining NextGen's board, opened the discussion. Director Torres, we've reviewed the audit findings. Walk us through what happened with the compliance training. Torres presented her version. Called it a communication gap. Said the initial training focused on conceptual understanding while the follow-up provided procedural detail. Explained that the sequencing hadn't been clearly communicated, leading to confusion. It was a careful reframing. Not technically false, but missing the key point that the sequencing hadn't been planned. Sterling looked at me. Miss Mason, you conducted both trainings? I conducted the second training. The first training was conducted by Donovan Fredericks for marketing. Why did you conduct the second training and not the first? Director Torres felt Donovan's presentation style would be more engaging for participants. But you're the compliance expert. Yes. And the first training omitted material required by regulation? The first training covered high-level concepts. The procedural details and regulatory checkpoints were presented in the second session. One of the other board members, a woman named Octavia, leaned forward. Were those procedural details optional? No. They're required for regulatory compliance. So staff were implementing a compliance process for 4 days without understanding the required procedures. That's correct. Sterling tapped his pen against his notepad. Director Torres, whose decision was it to have someone from marketing conduct compliance training? Torres shifted in her seat. I made that decision based on presentation considerations. Did Miss Mason advise you that dividing the content would create a control gap? There wasn't time for that discussion. The decision was made the morning of the training. So you made a same-day decision to change instructors and content for regulatory compliance training without consulting your compliance expert. The room was very quiet. Torres's voice was steady but tight. I used my judgment about presentation effectiveness. In retrospect, I should have consulted more closely with Sally about content requirements. Sterling looked at me. Miss Mason, if you're asked to recommend policy changes to prevent this situation from recurring, what would you suggest? I pulled out the document I'd prepared. 3 changes. First, require that all compliance training materials be reviewed and approved by a certified compliance officer before delivery. Second, require that anyone conducting compliance training has subject matter certification verified by the compliance team. Third, implement a post-training assessment within 48 hours to identify gaps before they create control deficiencies. Would these changes have prevented the situation we're discussing? Yes. The first requirement would have flagged that the abbreviated content was insufficient. The second would have ensured the trainer understood the regulatory requirements. The third would have identified the gaps immediately rather than after implementation began. Director Torres, any objection to implementing these policies? No. They're reasonable controls. Sterling made a note. We'll formalize these as policy revisions. Miss Mason, you'll work with our legal team to draft the specific language? Of course. One more question. The audit report notes that you documented all the questions and errors that occurred during the 4-day gap. That documentation was critical to understanding the scope of the problem. Is that standard practice for you? Yes. I track implementation metrics for all new processes. Why? Because compliance isn't static. You need to monitor whether procedures are being followed correctly and identify problems early. Documentation creates the evidence base for corrective action. Octavia smiled slightly. In other words, you do the unglamorous work that keeps this company out of regulatory trouble. I do the detailed work that regulatory frameworks require. After the meeting, Torres and I walked back toward the elevators in silence. As we waited for the doors to open, she finally spoke. You made me look bad in there. I answered questions accurately. You could have supported my characterization. Made it sound less like a mistake. It was a mistake. One that created measurable risk. The board needed to understand that to make informed decisions. The elevator doors opened. We stepped in. You're very good at covering yourself, Torres said. All that documentation. All those careful answers. Very strategic. I'm very good at compliance. Strategy is incidental. The doors closed. We rode up in silence.